Dorothy Lawson arrived in Calico Flats, New Mexico Territory, on the first Thursday of April in 1883, with a carpetbag in one hand, a letter of grievance folded tight in the other, and a fury in her chest so old and so hot that it had scorched everything soft out of her before she ever crossed the Missouri River. She stepped off the stagecoach with the deliberate weight of a woman who has rehearsed her arrival many times in her mind, and found the reality of the place immediately inferior to her anger. The town was exactly what she had been warned it would be: a single main street carved out of the red earth like an afterthought, buildings that looked as though they had been constructed in a single afternoon and never once improved upon, and a sky so enormous and so indifferent that it made her feel both very small and very furious. She was 26 years old. She had sold nearly everything she owned in Cincinnati, and she had crossed half a continent to find out who had stolen the land deed that had belonged to her father before his death and was supposed to belong to her now. The letter in her hand was from a lawyer named Gerald Finch, stationed here in Calico Flats, who had written to inform her, with what she considered an entirely inappropriate level of cheerfulness, that the parcel of land her father, Robert Lawson, had filed on and paid for in 1878 had since been claimed by a local rancher under disputed circumstances, and that if she wished to contest the matter, she would need to appear in person. She had read that letter 6 times on the train and 4 more times on the stage, and each reading had added another layer of indignation to the one that came before it. New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1883, was still a place of competing claims and unsteady law. The railroad had come through the southern part of the territory a couple of years prior and had changed things considerably, bringing commerce and a kind of rough civilization to towns that had previously existed mostly on luck and stubbornness. But it had also brought speculators and land agents and men who understood how to work the gaps between what was legal and what was enforceable, and those men had done considerable damage to people who had trusted the process. Dorothy's father had been one of those people. Robert Lawson had been a quiet, methodical man, a former schoolteacher who had caught Western fever in his early 50s and had filed on a parcel of good grazing land in the territory, intending to retire there eventually. He had never made it. He had died of a fever in the winter of 1880, before he had ever seen his land in person, and Dorothy had been trying to untangle his affairs ever since. The deed had been among his papers, properly signed and witnessed, filed with the land office, and then somehow, through some process she had not yet been able to fully document, it had ended up in the hands of a man named Aldous Cray, who ran the largest cattle operation in the county and who, from everything Dorothy had read in the letters and newspaper clippings she had collected, was not a man who was accustomed to being questioned. She did not care how accustomed he was to anything. She had come west carrying her father's deed and her father's name and approximately zero tolerance for the kind of casual theft that men in positions of power preferred to call a misunderstanding. The stagecoach driver set her trunk down in the dust with a thud and tipped his hat. A dog somewhere behind the general store barked twice and then went quiet. The main street of Calico Flats smelled like horse and dust and something faintly metallic that she could not identify. Dorothy squared her shoulders, picked up her carpetbag, and walked toward the first building she could see with a sign she could read, which turned out to be a saloon. She was not going into the saloon. She turned left. The lawyer's office was 3 buildings down from the saloon, sandwiched between a dry goods store and a small building with a barred window that she assumed was the jail. Gerald Finch was a slight, nervous man of about 40 with ink-stained fingers and the look of someone who had once had more ambitions and had arrived at a kind of peaceful resignation about it. He stood when she came in and extended his hand, and then looked immediately as though he wished he had thought of something better to do with it when she shook it with the grip of someone settling a debt. "Miss Lawson," he said, "I am very glad you made the journey. I must say, I did not know whether you would come." I wrote you a letter saying I was coming, Dorothy said, setting her carpetbag on the chair across from his desk and remaining standing herself. Did you not receive it? I did receive it, yes, but sometimes the territory has a way of— I am here, Dorothy said. Tell me about the deed. Gerald Finch told her about the deed. The telling of it was worse in some ways than she had imagined because the mechanism of it was so ordinary. The Territorial Land Office had experienced a fire in 1879, a small one which had damaged or destroyed a portion of its records. In the confusion that followed, certain claims had been refiled, and in the refiling certain discrepancies had emerged, and those discrepancies had been resolved. He used that word very carefully in favor of claims supported by affidavits from local residents, and Aldous Cray had produced 3 such affidavits attesting that the parcel had never been legitimately filed upon. Dorothy's father's original filing, Gerald Finch said apologetically, had not survived the fire. The copy, Dorothy said. My father kept a copy. Yes, you mentioned that in your correspondence. The trouble is, Miss Lawson, that a private copy is not. It is notarized, Dorothy said. It was notarized in Cincinnati, by a notary whose records still exist, whose office has already confirmed in writing that the notarization was valid, and I have that confirmation with me. She opened her carpetbag and produced a sheaf of papers, which she placed on his desk with the precise, deliberate care of someone placing a winning hand on a table. I also have correspondence from my father to a friend here in the territory, dated 1878, in which he describes the parcel and the filing in specific detail. I have a receipt from the land office, not the territorial office, the federal office in Santa Fe, acknowledging receipt of his filing fee. And I have a letter from a senator, who is a personal acquaintance of my father's, who is prepared to make inquiries if the matter is not resolved appropriately. Gerald Finch looked at the papers. He looked at Dorothy. He looked back at the papers with the expression of a man who has just realized that the situation he thought was straightforward is, in fact, considerably more complicated than he had anticipated. Miss Lawson, he said, you are, I think, more prepared than most of the people who come through my door. I was a schoolteacher for 4 years, Dorothy said. I understand documentation. The problem, Gerald Finch explained over the next hour, was not the documentation. The documentation, he agreed, appeared very solid. The problem was Aldous Cray. Aldous Cray had been operating in this territory for 8 years. He employed a significant portion of the county's workforce. He had relationships with the local judge, with the county sheriff, with the land office administrator. He was not a man who would simply receive a sheaf of papers and relinquish a piece of land he had incorporated into his grazing operation. He would contest it. He would delay it. He would make the legal process as expensive and as exhausting as possible because he had the resources to outlast most opponents, and he knew it. How long would it take? Dorothy asked. Months, Gerald Finch said. Possibly a year, possibly longer. Dorothy looked at the wall behind him, which had a calendar on it showing April 1883. She thought about the amount of money she had brought with her, which was enough for several months if she was careful. She thought about Cincinnati and the small apartment she had given up and the teaching position she had resigned. There was nothing to go back to. She had made the calculation before she left, and the calculation had come out the same every time. This land was the last thing her father had left her, and she was not going to let it be taken without a fight. I will need lodgings, she said. Something respectable and within reasonable cost. Mrs. Patton takes boarders, Gerald Finch said. She runs a clean house on the east side of town, reasonable rates, good food. Dorothy picked up her papers and tucked them back into her carpetbag. Then I will go there, and I will need you to file an official contest on Monday morning. I want it on the record immediately. Miss Lawson, Gerald Finch said, with what she thought was genuine concern, you should understand that Cray is not a gentle opponent. He will not be pleased. I expect he won't, Dorothy said. She picked up her bag and walked to the door. "Neither am I." She found Mrs. Patton's boarding house without difficulty. Clara Patton was a broad, comfortable woman of about 50 with gray-streaked hair and the kind of direct manner that Dorothy immediately found reassuring. She showed Dorothy a room on the second floor with a window that looked out over a small kitchen garden, a clean quilt on the narrow bed, and a washstand with an actual mirror. Dorothy paid 2 weeks in advance, which pleased Mrs. Patton, and was told that supper was at 6 and breakfast at 7, and that the parlor was available for her use in the evenings. At supper that first evening, Dorothy was introduced to the other boarders. A young surveyor from Colorado named Patrick Webb, who was in town on contract, a quiet widow named Martha Ellison, who was waiting for a matter with her late husband's estate to be settled, and a man named Thomas Redmond. Thomas Redmond was the kind of man who entered a room without particularly trying to dominate it and somehow ended up being the thing you looked at. He was 30 years old, tall without being imposing, with dark hair that had been cut recently but not recently enough, and the kind of tan that came from spending the majority of one's life outside. He had very clear gray eyes, the color of the sky just before rain, and a way of sitting in a chair that suggested he was comfortable in his own body without being smug about it. He worked, Mrs. Patton mentioned as she made the introductions, as the ranch foreman for a smaller spread north of town, a place called the Cross Creek, ranch owned by a man named Sam Ellery who was elderly and unwell, and who had trusted Thomas with the running of the operation for the past 3 years. Thomas Redmond looked up when Dorothy sat down across the table from him, and he said, "Welcome to Calico Flats, Miss Lawson," with the easy politeness of someone who has been raised to be polite and has continued being polite because it costs him nothing and it matters to him. Dorothy said, "Thank you," in a tone that could charitably be described as civil. She was not interested in being charming. She was not interested in making friends. She was interested in her case, in her father's land, and in leaving this territory as soon as the matter was resolved, preferably with the deed in her hand and a complete disregard for everything behind her. But supper at Mrs. Patton's was a communal affair, and the table was small enough that avoiding conversation would have required a level of deliberate rudeness that even Dorothy's current state of mind wouldn't quite allow. Patrick Webb talked enthusiastically about the survey work he was doing, which involved measuring distances across terrain that kept trying to defeat him. Martha Ellison asked Dorothy politely where she had come from and what had brought her to Calico Flats, and Dorothy gave a brief, factual account of her situation that was honest but not particularly warm. Mrs. Patton moved in and out of the kitchen, refilling the bread basket and asking after everyone's day. Thomas Redmond was mostly quiet through the meal. He ate with the straightforward appreciation of someone who had been working hard since before dawn, and he listened to the conversation without pressing himself into it. Once, when Patrick Webb said something about the difficulty of filing land claims and Dorothy made a short, bitter comment about the unreliability of the territorial records system, Thomas glanced up at her with an expression that was neither dismissive nor oversympathetic, just a kind of clear-eyed attention, as though he was actually hearing what she was saying underneath what she was saying. It annoyed her, that look. She wasn't sure why. After supper, she retreated to the parlor and spread her papers on the writing desk and worked by lamplight until her eyes hurt, organizing her documents into a precise order that would be most useful for Gerald Finch's filing. Sometime around 9 o'clock, she heard the front door open and close, and Thomas Redmond's footsteps going up the stairs, quiet and even. She heard him stop on the landing for a moment, and she was briefly, irrationally aware of the thin wall between the parlor and the hallway, and then his footsteps continued, and a door closed, and she put her attention back on her papers and did not think about him again that night. The following morning Dorothy was up at 6:30, before breakfast, and walked to the land office to introduce herself and make her intentions clear. The land office administrator was a man named Bert Holloway, who had small eyes and a large desk, and a manner that Dorothy recognized immediately as belonging to men who have become important in small places and are very sensitive about it. He received her politely but coolly, and when she mentioned Aldous Cray's name and the nature of her contest, his manner cooled further. He told her that these matters took time and that the process was in place for a reason, and that she would need to work through the appropriate legal channels. Dorothy told him she was already doing exactly that and thanked him and left. She walked back toward the boarding house and nearly walked directly into Thomas Redmond, who was coming from the direction of the livery stable with a bridle in his hand and appeared to be thinking about something else entirely. He stepped back, she stepped back, and they stood there in the morning dust looking at each other for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "I wasn't paying attention." "Neither was I," Dorothy admitted, which was technically true since she had been replaying the conversation with Holloway and calibrating the degree of his hostility. "You're going to the land office?" he asked, noting the direction from which she had come. "I've already been." He looked at her for a moment with that same quality of attention that had bothered her at supper. "Holloway give you any trouble?" "He was uncooperative," Dorothy said. "I expected that." Thomas nodded slowly. He turned the bridle over in his hands once, looking at nothing in particular. "Aldous Cray has a lot of friends in this town," he said. It was not offered as discouragement. It was offered as simple information, the way a person would tell you a road was washed out, not to stop you from going, but so you knew what you were dealing with. "I know that," Dorothy said. "I have documentation." "Documentation is important," Thomas said. "So is knowing who in town will be straight with you and who won't be." Dorothy looked at him. She was not sure whether this was the beginning of an offer or just an observation, and she was disposed to be suspicious of offers from men in this territory, because every man she had dealt with since crossing into New Mexico had either been actively unhelpful or had come with some agenda of his own attached. But Thomas Redmond was looking at her without agenda in his face, just that steady, gray-eyed directness, and she found herself saying, despite herself, "Do you have a recommendation?" "Deputy Holt," Thomas said. "Miles Holt." "He's the deputy sheriff, not the sheriff. The sheriff is Cray's man, has been for years. But Miles is his own man. He's fair. If you need anyone official to talk to who'll actually listen to you, he's the one." Dorothy filed that away. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, because it was the thing she genuinely wanted to know. Thomas seemed to consider the question as though it had not occurred to him that it required consideration. "Because you're clearly trying to do something that's right," he said, "and this place makes it harder than it should be to do things that are right. I don't see why that should go without someone pointing out what they know." It was a straightforward answer, and it sat in Dorothy's chest in a way she wasn't entirely sure what to do with. She thanked him with what she recognized was somewhat more warmth than she usually allowed herself, and they went their separate ways. Over the following 2 weeks, the legal contest moved with the grinding slowness that Gerald Finch had predicted. The filing was made, acknowledged, and then subjected to a preliminary challenge from Aldous Cray's lawyer, a sharp man named Vandermeer who had come all the way from Albuquerque and who had clearly been hired specifically because he was very good at making straightforward matters appear complicated. Dorothy attended every meeting Gerald Finch had with Vandermeer, which surprised the lawyer and clearly irritated Vandermeer, and she asked precise questions and made notes in a small leather journal that she kept in her apron pocket. Calico Flats slowly became less alien to her, in the way that places do when you are forced to spend enough time in them, not beloved, but mapped. She learned where the general store kept the best quality paper, which was behind the counter and required asking. She learned that the cafe on the corner served decent coffee in the mornings. She learned that the creek north of town was the place people went when they wanted to be alone, and she went there herself on evenings when the pressure in her chest from a day of legal frustration had built to the point where she needed to be somewhere that wasn't a room. At supper every evening, the boarding house table filled in around her, and Thomas Redmond was there most nights, quieter than Patrick Webb, more grounded than Martha Ellison, and always possessed of that quality of calm that Dorothy found simultaneously irritating and inexplicably comforting. They began to talk more. Not at length, at first. He would ask how her day had gone, and she would tell him, honestly, without embellishment, and he would listen with his full attention in that way he had, and occasionally say something that was so precisely useful that it took her a moment to register it. One evening she mentioned, with considerable frustration, that Vandermeer had produced a second affidavit she hadn't anticipated, signed by a man named Doyle, who claimed to have witnessed the original filing office burn, and to have seen Robert Lawson's paperwork among the materials that were destroyed. Dorothy said she didn't understand how such an affidavit could be accepted when the fire had been nearly 4 years ago and Doyle had not mentioned it in any prior proceeding. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Doyle works for Cray, has for about a year. He came in from somewhere east, nobody knows exactly where. He doesn't own anything here. He has no stake in this beyond what Cray pays him." Dorothy put down her fork and looked at him. "How do you know that?" "I've been in this county 3 years," Thomas said. "I pay attention to people." Patrick Webb, who was eating his pie and not particularly following the conversation, said, "Thomas knows everybody worth knowing in this county. It's a useful quality." Dorothy looked at Thomas for a moment. Would Doyle be willing to say where he actually was in 1879? If he's been here only a year, he could not have witnessed anything in 1879. "He wasn't anywhere near here in 1879, Thomas said. "I know a man who knew Doyle from before, from up in Colorado. He came here in '82. Dorothy felt the first real, clean surge of forward movement she had experienced since arriving. "If I could get that person to make a statement." "I'll ask him tomorrow," Thomas said, as simply as though he were offering to pass the bread basket. Dorothy looked at him across the table. Something shifted very slightly in the tight geography of how she was thinking about him. She said, "You would do that. You don't have any stake in this." Thomas met her eyes. In the lamplight of the dining room, his gray eyes were darker, warmer somehow. "That man Doyle is going to lie in front of a legal proceeding to help someone take something that isn't his," he said. "That's not something I can know about and not do anything about." She looked at him for a moment longer than she intended. Then she looked at her plate and picked up her fork and said quietly, "Thank you." The word that came from a place she hadn't expected to find undefended. The man Thomas knew, a livestock dealer named Pete Calloway who passed through Calico Flats on a regular basis, did indeed make a written statement attesting that Doyle had been living in Colorado through all of 1879 and had told Calloway himself that he had never been to New Mexico Territory before 1882. Gerald Finch received the statement with visible relief and filed it immediately, and Vandermeer spent the better part of 3 hours with a face like a closed fist trying to figure out how to neutralize it. He could not, in the end, neutralize it well, because the truth is considerably more difficult to dismantle than the manufactured version. The day the preliminary challenge was denied and the full hearing was scheduled for late June, Dorothy walked out of Gerald Finch's office into the bright May afternoon and stood on the main street and felt, for the first time since she had arrived, something that was not exactly hope. She had been careful about hope, but was at least its prerequisite. Thomas was crossing the street toward the hardware store and happened to see her standing there. He changed direction and came to her, reading her face as he walked, and by the time he reached her he was already beginning a small smile. "Good news," he said. "The hearing is set," Dorothy said. "Finch thinks our case is strong." Thomas looked at her with something warm and unguarded in his face, something that was just genuine gladness on her behalf, and Dorothy felt a very strange thing happen in the middle of her chest, a brief, bright loosening, like a coat that has been buttoned too tight suddenly having a button come undone. "That calls for coffee," Thomas said, "or pie if you're partial to pie." "I am partial to pie," Dorothy said, which was true. They sat at the corner cafe for an hour and a half. Dorothy was not sure afterward exactly how it had happened. how an hour and a half had passed without her noticing. But what she remembered was that they talked about her father, and this was the unusual part, because she almost never talked about her father, and Thomas had asked questions with the kind of genuine interest that made answering feel less like explanation and more like remembering, which was something she had been afraid to do too often, because remembering her father led to missing him. And missing him was a door she had largely kept closed, because behind it was the full weight of everything she was here to fight for. But Thomas asked about who Robert Lawson had been, not just what he had owned, and she found herself describing a man who had read Dickens aloud at dinner and kept a careful journal of every bird he had ever seen, and had, late in his life, developed an inexplicable optimism about the West that Dorothy had thought was somewhat naive, until she was standing in the New Mexico light herself and understood, a little, what he had felt when he read the land descriptions. Thomas listened. He did not offer platitudes. When she finished talking, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He sounds like someone worth fighting for." It was such a simple thing to say. Dorothy looked at her coffee cup and blinked twice, which was as close to visible emotion as she was willing to get in a public establishment. "Tell me something about yourself," she said, because she needed to talk about something else, and because she was, despite everything, genuinely curious. Thomas had grown up in Texas, he told her, on a small ranch that his parents had worked hard to keep and had ultimately lost to a prolonged drought when he was 16. His father had moved the family north and found work on larger spreads, and Thomas had discovered that he was very good at the work itself: the cattle, the land management, the reading of weather and grass and season, and had built a life out of that competence steadily, over years, moving from hand to foreman through consistent, reliable work. He had come to New Mexico territory 3 years ago because Sam Ellery had offered him a fair wage and a degree of independence that larger outfits did not, and he had found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he liked it here in a way he had not expected. "What is there to like?" Dorothy asked, and she genuinely wanted to know because she was working to remain immune to this landscape. Thomas thought about it. "The light," he said. "In the evening when the sun is going down, the light here does something to the color of everything. Turns the red earth almost orange, turns the scrub silver. I saw it my first week here and I thought I had never seen anything so clean." Dorothy thought about this. Clean was not the word she would have chosen for this dusty, complicated, often unjust territory. But she thought about the evenings at the creek, and the way the last light hit the water, and she understood, slightly against her will, what he meant. She did not tell him she understood. Not yet. She was not ready to give this place that much. Over the following weeks, as May deepened and the New Mexico heat began its gradual escalation toward summer, something happened between Dorothy Lawson and Thomas Redmond that neither of them particularly planned. They began to walk together in the evenings. It started practically. Thomas was going to the creek to check on water levels for the ranch, and Dorothy had taken to walking there herself, and it was natural enough to walk in the same direction at the same time. But practicality has a way of becoming preference when the company is good enough. Dorothy discovered that Thomas Redmond had a way of being present that she had not encountered much in her life. He was not filling silence because he was uncomfortable with it. He was simply there, attending to the same world she was attending to, and occasionally saying something about it that was worth saying. He noticed things: the way the meadowlarks came back to the same stretch of grass each evening, the quality of the creek's current that told him something about the upstream snowmelt, the way certain clouds moved differently than others, and what that meant for the following day. He had the knowledge of a man who had spent his life paying attention to the natural world, and he shared it without showing off, the way you share something with someone because it interests them, not because you want credit for knowing it. Dorothy had been, for most of her adult life, the person in the room who knew the most and was least acknowledged for it. She had been a school teacher in a time when female teachers were accepted but not particularly respected, and she had carried a considerable amount of quiet indignation about that for years. Thomas Redmond did not treat her as though her intelligence was a surprise. He treated her as though it was simply a quality she had, like being tall or having brown hair, and it was so different from what she was accustomed to that it took her several weeks to identify the difference and understand why it felt so remarkable. She told him, one evening in early June while they were sitting on the bank of the creek watching the light do what Thomas had said it did, that she had been more angry since coming to this territory than she had been in years, possibly ever. More angry than the specific anger she had brought with her about the land. This whole place operates on a system that is built to work for certain people and not others, she said. And everyone here seems to have simply accepted that as the way things are. Thomas was quiet for a moment, watching the water. Most of them have accepted it because they can't afford not to, he said. When you're dependent on the people who make the rules for your livelihood, the calculation is different. That doesn't make it right, Dorothy said. No, Thomas agreed without hesitation. It doesn't, she looked at him. Does it bother you, working in a system like this? He turned to look at her. The evening light was doing exactly the thing he had described to her weeks ago, and in it his face was very clear and very honest. Yes, he said simply, it does. That's part of why I work for Sam Ellery. He's a fair man. He treats his workers decently. In a territory where that's not universal, it matters enough to stay for. Dorothy held his gaze for a long moment. She felt in that moment the specific quality of a prejudice dissolving, not the large, structural kind that she had good reason for, but the smaller, personal one she had erected around this particular man, made of the material of too many disappointing encounters with men in positions of moderate authority. Thomas Redmond was not one of those men. He was something else, something she did not quite have the language for yet, and the not having of language for it was both frustrating and, in a way she was only beginning to admit to herself, interesting. She looked away first, back at the water. I should go over my testimony for the hearing, she said. When is it? Thomas asked. June 24th. I'll be there, he said, as though this required no explanation. Dorothy felt that loosening again, larger this time, spreading across her chest like warmth. She said, you don't have to be. I know, Thomas said. She did not tell him not to come. The days before the hearing were among the most keyed up of Dorothy's life. She prepared with the same methodical precision she had brought to everything, sitting at the parlor writing desk each evening until the lamp burned low, rehearsing the sequence of evidence and the responses she anticipated needing to give under Vandermeer's cross-examination, which she knew would be searching and hostile. Gerald Finch had been increasingly confident as the date approached, bolstered by Pete Calloway's statement, and by two additional pieces of documentation that Dorothy had found through her own research. A letter from her father to the Santa Fe Land Office inquiring about his filing, which she had located through a federal records request, and a notation in the territorial records indicating that a payment had been received from a Robert Lawson of Cincinnati, Ohio, in July 1878. Aldous Cray she had not yet seen in person. She knew what he looked like from the description of people who had pointed him out. A large, red-faced man in his late 50s, with the manner of someone who has been wealthy in a small place for a long time, and has confused the deference he receives for the deference he deserves. She had seen him once at a distance, crossing the main street with his lawyer beside him, and she had felt a surge of cold dislike that she recognized as the specific kind, not the hot, expansive anger she carried against the territory generally, but the precise, focused kind that comes from looking at someone and seeing clearly what they have done. Thomas noticed, the evening before the hearing, that she was more wound up than usual. They were walking back from the creek later than they usually did, because neither of them had wanted to leave. She was conscious of not wanting to leave, which was itself something she was still adjusting to, and the stars were already out, a quantity of stars that she had not known was possible before coming west, the sky absolutely crowded with them. You should sleep, Thomas said. You know your case. You've known it better than anyone in that room for months." "I know," Dorothy said. "Knowing doesn't stop the thinking." They had stopped walking, somewhere between the creek and the edge of town, in the dark space between two sources of light, and the night was warm and quiet around them, and Dorothy was very aware of how close he was standing, which was not dramatically close, but close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cooling air. "Dorothy," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name without the miss, and it landed somewhere she was not expecting, low and warm, and she looked up at him and found him looking down at her with an expression that was so entirely, simply honest that it disarmed her in the way she was never disarmed, completely and without warning. "What?" she said very quietly. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "you came here and you fought it right. Your father would know that." She felt the back of her throat tighten. She had not cried since before she left Cincinnati, because she had not allowed herself, because crying felt like softness and softness felt like vulnerability and vulnerability felt like something she could not afford to be in enemy territory. But Thomas said that, and something moved in her that she had been keeping very still, and she looked up at the enormous sky and breathed slowly until it settled. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was even. Mostly. Thomas was quiet beside her. After a moment he said, "You've been carrying all of this alone for a very long time." "Yes," Dorothy said, because it was true and she was too tired tonight of all nights to pretend it was otherwise. "You don't have to," Thomas said. He said it simply, not as a promise of anything in particular, just as a statement of a fact, and somehow that was more powerful than a promise would have been. Dorothy stood in the warm dark and felt something she had not felt in years, the specific relief of being seen by someone who is seeing you accurately. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "I don't know how to do that." "I know," Thomas said gently, "but you could learn." They walked back to the boarding house in a silence that was the most comfortable silence Dorothy had ever been in. She slept. She had not expected to, but she did. The hearing on June 24th was held in the county courthouse, a building that smelled of wood polish and old paper and anxiety, and it was the most important 2 hours of Dorothy's time in the territory. Judge Whitmore presided, not the judge she would have chosen, since he was a man of the old school who had his own established relationships in the county. But he was also, critically, a man who placed considerable importance on his own dignity and his own reputation for conducting proper proceedings, which meant he was less susceptible to private influence than men who cared less about either of those things. Dorothy sat beside Gerald Finch at the plaintiff's table and across the room from Aldous Cray, who was larger in person than she had registered from a distance, and who looked at her with the flat, measuring look of a man who has not yet decided whether she is a serious problem or an inconvenience. She looked back at him without expression. Vandermeer was very good. Dorothy had anticipated this. He challenged the notarization, the chain of custody of the documents, the credibility of Pete Calloway's statement. He attempted, with considerable skill, to introduce questions about Robert Lawson's mental capacity in his later years that Dorothy found genuinely infuriating, and that Gerald Finch objected to, and that the judge sustained. He argued that the territorial record system was complex enough that honest disputes could arise without any implication of bad faith on anyone's part. But Gerald Finch was also good, steady and precise in a way that Dorothy suspected Vandermeer had underestimated, and Dorothy's documentation was simply very good. The federal payment receipt, the letter from the Santa Fe office, the certified copy of the notarized deed. The testimony of Pete Calloway's statement, delivered into the record, that directly contradicted Doyle's affidavit and made Doyle's testimony essentially untenable. The senator's letter, which the judge read with an expression that suggested he was very aware of what it represented. Judge Whitmore retired to consider his ruling at noon and returned at 2 in the afternoon. Dorothy sat at the table with her hands folded in her lap and her back very straight and her breathing controlled, and she listened to the judge explain, in the measured language of legal proceedings, that the documentation submitted by the plaintiff was compelling, that the contradictions in the defendant's supporting affidavits were significant, that the federal payment receipt constituted strong evidence of a properly made filing, and that he was ruling in favor of Dorothy Lawson with respect to the contested parcel. He paused. He looked at Aldous Cray over his glasses with an expression that was professionally neutral but contained, Dorothy thought, some additional message. "The court," he said, "finds no direct evidence of deliberate fraud in this proceeding." He paused again, very slightly. "However, the court does find the internal inconsistencies in the defendant's supporting testimony to be sufficient grounds for the ruling I have stated, and I would caution all parties that this court takes the integrity of property records very seriously." It was as close as he could come, within the careful architecture of legal language, to saying what everyone in the room understood. And it was enough. Dorothy left the courthouse into the full afternoon sun of late June with the official ruling in her hand, and she stopped on the top step and breathed in and breathed out and let herself, for the first time since she had arrived, feel the ground beneath her feet as something that belonged to her as a matter of right in this territory. Thomas was there. He was standing at the bottom of the steps, having sat through the entire hearing from the back of the room without drawing attention to himself, and he was looking up at her with an expression that held everything he had been hoping for on her behalf, all of it visible and honest in his face. Dorothy descended the steps. She stopped in front of him. The main street of Calico Flats was going about its ordinary afternoon business around them, horses and wagons and voices and dust, and she looked at Thomas Redmond and felt the last of the hard shell she had built around herself for this journey crack cleanly through, not catastrophically, but the way ice cracks in spring suddenly, and because the season is ready for it. "We won," she said. Her voice came out different than she expected. Not the controlled, professional voice she had used for 2 months, something more real. "You won," Thomas said. "This was yours." Dorothy shook her head slightly. "You helped me, the statement from Callaway." "That was me pointing at a door," Thomas said. "You walked through it." She looked at him for a long moment in the bright afternoon. There were things she had been not saying for weeks that were becoming increasingly difficult not to say, and she was a woman who did not like leaving important things unsaid, which had been causing her considerable internal difficulty for the past several weeks. "Thomas," she said. "Yes," he said simply, watching her. "I have been very angry at this territory for the entire time I have been here," she said. "I know," he said. "I have been angry at the land office and the legal system, and the people who benefit from the way things operate here and the heat and the dust, and the fact that everything feels like it is actively resisting whatever I am trying to do." She paused. "You are the one thing that I have not been able to be angry at." Thomas was very still for a moment. Then something moved in his face, not a smile exactly, it was too serious for a smile, but a deepening, a kind of warmth that came from somewhere solid and real in him. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" he asked. "I am still deciding," Dorothy said, and the slight curve of her mouth was entirely involuntary and she did not try to stop it. He reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to move away, and took her hand where it was hanging at her side, folding her fingers in his. His hand was warm and calloused and certain, and Dorothy held it. She was acutely aware that they were standing in the middle of the main street of Calico Flats in full afternoon light, and that this was not exactly a private moment, but she found that she did not care about that at all, which was itself a kind of information. "I would like to show you something," Thomas said, "this evening if you're willing." "What?" Dorothy asked. "The land," he said. "Your father's parcel, I know where it is. I've ridden past it, I'd like to take you there." Dorothy looked at him. Something rose in her throat that she swallowed carefully. Her father's land. Her land now officially on paper, under the law of this territory that had tried so hard to take it. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." They rode out in the evening on horses from the Cross Creek stable. Thomas had arranged it easily, with the uncomplicated competence he brought to all practical matters. And Dorothy, who had learned to ride as a girl but was not a frequent rider, found that the horse he had chosen for her was a patient, steady mare who forgave her for the rust in her technique. They rode north from town along a track that gradually grew less defined and eventually became simply a direction through the open grassland. The land her father had filed on was a parcel of about 300 acres, Thomas told her, running along a section of the creek's upper reach where the grass was better than in most of the surrounding country, and there was a natural windbreak of cottonwood trees along the water. It had been used by Cray as additional grazing for several years, and there would be work to do to establish her own operation on it, but it was good land. He said this with the authority of someone who understood land better than much of what people had paid similar prices for. They came around a rise and Dorothy saw it in the evening light, the long curve of the creek, the cottonwood trees with their leaves turning gold in the setting sun, the grass moving in the warm breeze, the sky enormous above it in shades of amber and rose and deep, deep blue at the edges. It was the most beautiful piece of the territory she had seen, and she understood, sitting on her patient mare at the top of the rise, exactly what her father had read in the land descriptions that had made him want this. She sat there for a long time without speaking. Thomas was beside her, quiet, giving her the space of it. "He would have loved it," she said finally, her voice very steady, her eyes very bright. "Yes," Thomas said. "He never saw it," Dorothy said. "He died before he ever—" She stopped. She breathed. "He never saw it." "No," Thomas said, "but you're seeing it, and you fought for it, and you're here." Dorothy turned to look at him. The light was extraordinary now, doing exactly the thing he had described to her weeks ago, turning everything golden and sharp and very clean, and Thomas Redmond in the middle of it was looking at her with such undefended warmth that she felt it like the sun itself. She said, very quietly, "Thomas, I think I have been falling in love with you for some time." He was very still for a moment. Then the expression on his face did something remarkable. It opened, like a door, wide and full, and she saw behind it all the things he had been being patient about for weeks, all the feeling he had been moving carefully around, the way you move carefully around something precious. "You are the least expected thing that has ever happened to me," he said, and his voice was very low and very serious. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Dorothy asked, and her mouth curved. "The best thing," Thomas said. He reached across the space between their horses and his hand found her face, and he kissed her gently, with all the care and all the warmth and none of the hesitancy of a man who has been wanting to do this for quite some time and has been waiting until the moment was real. Dorothy kissed him back in the evening light on the land her father had left her, with the cottonwoods gold around them and the creek running silver below, and the anger she had brought with her across half a continent loosened from her chest entirely, replaced by something she had not expected to find on the other side of it. They were quiet for a long time afterward, side by side on their horses, watching the light change. The first stars appeared above the eastern horizon. The air was warm and smelled of grass and water. "What will you do with it?" Thomas asked eventually. "The land." "I don't know yet," Dorothy said. "I hadn't let myself think that far. I was only trying to get to the winning." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, "You could stay." Dorothy looked at him. "I know that's a large thing to say," he said, "and I'm not saying it to put pressure on anything that should be allowed to grow at its own rate. I'm saying it because this territory, which has given you a lot of trouble, also has things worth staying for. Some of them are right here on this land. And some of them," Dorothy said, "are considerably less geographic." He looked at her, and the smile he gave her was the best she had ever seen on any face, wide and genuine and a little undone. "Yes," he said, "some of them are." Dorothy looked at her father's land, gold in the last of the evening light, and thought about Cincinnati, which had nothing left in it for her that she could name, and thought about what it would mean to build something here, in this difficult, extraordinary place. She thought about her father reading the land descriptions with his particular quality of optimism, and she thought about Thomas saying the light in the evening made everything look clean. "I would need a house," she said. Thomas said, very carefully, as though handling something he did not want to drop, "There are people who build them. I would need to learn the cattle business," she said. "I know absolutely nothing about cattle. There are people who know it who could teach you," Thomas said. "I would need," Dorothy said, and she turned to look at him fully, "considerably more evenings beside a creek with someone worth talking to." "That," Thomas said, "I can arrange personally." She laughed, actually laughed, free and real, the first time since she had come to this territory, and Thomas looked at her as though the sound was the best thing this land had ever produced, and maybe it was. They rode back to Calico Flats in the dark, close enough together that their horses' shoulders occasionally touched, and the stars above them were the full, crowded, unbelievable quantity of stars that the territory produced every clear night. And Dorothy looked up at them, and thought that her father had known something about this place that she had needed to come here angry to discover properly. The weeks that followed were the most interesting of Dorothy Lawson's life, and she was a woman who had had interesting weeks before. She stayed in Calico Flats, extending her arrangement with Mrs. Patton, and began the process of establishing what she would need to work her land. This was an education unlike any she had received in a schoolhouse. It was made of practical things, physical things, the kind of knowledge that lives in the hands and the body, and the specific attention to what the world is doing right now and what it will likely do next. Thomas was her primary teacher, with the patience and clarity of someone who has always understood that knowledge is worth sharing. He taught her to read the land, the quality of grass in different sections, the way water behaved at different seasons, what the condition of the soil meant for what could and could not be done with it. He introduced her to Sam Ellery, the elderly owner of Cross Creek Ranch, who turned out to be a spare, sharp-eyed man who listened to Dorothy for about 10 minutes and then told Thomas, in front of Dorothy as though she were not there, that she was smarter than most of the men in this county and Thomas should not let her leave. Thomas grinned at that, and Dorothy said to Sam Ellery directly, "I have no intention of leaving." Sam Ellery looked at her with something that might have been approval. "Good," he said. "We need people with sense." She made a friend in town, which surprised her, because she had not been expecting to make friends here and had not particularly been trying. Clara Patton, with whom she had been living as a boarder, turned out to be one of the most practically wise people Dorothy had ever encountered. Possessing a knowledge of this territory and its complicated social geography that had been built over 20 years of running a boarding house through which most of the county's population passed at one time or another. Clara had heard, by the time Dorothy had been there a week after the hearing, about the ruling and about Thomas and about the land, and she sat Dorothy down one evening in the kitchen and said, with the directness that Dorothy had always found refreshing, "That man has been good to every person in this house for the 3 years he has lived here. He helped Mrs. Ellison when her husband's estate was trying to be taken by her husband's brothers. He fixed my roof in November when no one else was available. He is the kind of man this territory needs more of, and I am telling you this because you look like someone who might talk yourself out of something good if given enough quiet time to do it." Dorothy looked at her for a moment. "I'm not talking myself out of anything," she said. "Good," Clara said, and poured her more coffee. Dorothy thought about talking herself out of things later that night, alone in her room with the honesty that solitude demands. It was true that she had a pattern, she had recognized it in herself, of pulling back from things that felt important, of protecting herself from the scale of what she might lose by not fully engaging with what she might gain. She had done it with people before, with places. She understood where it came from losing her mother young, from watching her father's health decline, from a series of experiences that had taught her that the things you relied on could be taken. The land case had been, in some ways, the largest expression of that pattern, She had come here to retrieve something that had been taken, and she had armored herself completely to do it. Thomas had come through the armor sideways without trying. He had simply been himself, consistently, in her vicinity, and she had not been able to maintain the armor against that. She thought about this with something between gratitude and mild exasperation, and came to the conclusion that Clara was right, and that she was not going to talk herself out of anything. Thomas arrived at supper 2 evenings later with the information that a man named Brooks, who was a builder, was available to begin construction on a small house on her land within the month, and that Sam Ellery had agreed to loan her a small starter herd of 12 cattle from his own stock as an arrangement against a share of the following year's calf crop, which was an extraordinarily generous offer that Dorothy suspected was as much about Thomas as it was about any sound business logic. She told Thomas this, and he said, "Sam is a fair man, with the equanimity of someone who is not going to take credit for more than belongs to him. He is also," Dorothy said, "clearly fond of you." "He's been good to me," Thomas said. "I'd like to be good to him in return. That's all it is." Dorothy watched him across the supper table in Mrs. Patton's dining room, in the warm lamplight that was so familiar to her now, and felt the specific quality of love that comes from knowing someone well enough to understand that the small things they say are consistent with the large things they do, that there is no gap between the person they present and the person they are. It was, she thought, the rarest thing she had ever encountered. That Sunday, which was the first Sunday of July, Thomas took her to the high country west of town in the early morning, a place he went occasionally when he needed to think. It was above the valley, above the heat and the dust, where the air was cooler and the land was different, more dramatic. The red rock formations that the territory was known for rising in shapes that were so improbable they looked like a painter had been given too much creative latitude. They tied their horses and climbed a short distance and sat on a flat rock with the whole valley below them, and the morning spreading out golden in every direction. Thomas said after a long, comfortable silence, "I have something I want to say to you." Dorothy looked at him. Her heart did the thing it had been doing for several weeks now, the heightened, uncertain thing, but steadier than it used to be. "I've been thinking about what I want," Thomas said. He was looking at the valley, but he turned to look at her. "And I'm aware that you've been here only 3 months, and that you came here for a specific purpose, and that you're still building something new, and I don't want to put a claim on anything before you've had the space to build it. But I also—" He stopped and started again, with the precision of someone who wants to say the right thing. "I would like to ask you to consider a future that includes me, not just the evenings at the creek, not just supper at Mrs. Patton's. I mean," he reached into his coat pocket and produced, with a seriousness that she found infinitely endearing, a simple gold ring that caught the morning light. "I mean a life, Dorothy, if you want one with me." Dorothy looked at the ring. She looked at his face, which was entirely exposed and honest and a little nervous in a way she had not seen before. This was Thomas beyond his characteristic composure, and the vulnerability in him was so genuine that it made her chest ache with tenderness. She thought about Cincinnati. She thought about the school where she had taught, the life she had had, the plan she had brought with her across the Missouri River and the Mississippi, across the plains and into this red, difficult, extraordinary place. She thought about her father's land in the evening light. She thought about every conversation at the creek, every supper, every morning she had woken up in this territory and found, slowly and without intending to, that it had become somewhere she recognized. "Thomas," she said. "Yes," he said. "I came here carrying a considerable amount of anger," she said. "I know," he said. "I was angry at this entire territory," she said. "I was angry at the legal system and the land office and the men who ran them and the dust and the heat and the distance and the whole enterprise." "I know," Thomas said. He was watching her very carefully. "You were the one thing," Dorothy said, "that I could not stay angry at, no matter how determined I was to remain angry at everything." He held her gaze. "Yes," Dorothy said, and the word was full and certain and real. "Yes, I want a life with you." He put the ring on her finger with hands that were not quite steady, and she held his face in her hands and kissed him in the morning light on top of the red rock with the whole golden valley below them. And it was nothing like what she had imagined when she was 22 and reading novels about love and thinking it would look entirely different from this. Nothing like it in a way that was completely and entirely better. They were married in September, in the small white church at the edge of Calico Flats, by the minister who came through from the next town on alternating Sundays. The guests were modest in number. Clara Patton, who stood in the front pew with the expression of someone whose investment has paid off. Sam Ellery, who came in from Cross Creek and sat straight-backed and bright-eyed. Patrick Webb, who was still in town on his extended contract and who had become a genuine friend to both of them. Martha Ellison, whose own matter had been settled and who was moving back east next month. Miles Holt, the deputy, who shook Thomas's hand afterward with considerable feeling, and Gerald Finch, who had been better throughout the whole proceedings than Dorothy had initially given him credit for, and who appeared genuinely moved. Dorothy wore a dress she had made in Santa Fe. She had made a short trip there with Clara for the purpose, in a deep blue that caught the light beautifully, and she carried a small bouquet of the wildflowers that grew along her section of the creek in the autumn, which Thomas had gathered that morning. She walked down the aisle of the small church alone, which she had chosen because she was a woman who had walked alone for a long time and was not ashamed of it, and because she was walking toward Thomas, who was standing at the front of the church looking at her with an expression that was so fully, helplessly in love that the minister had to clear his throat gently to get his attention. Thomas said his vows in a voice that was low and certain and did not waver once, and Dorothy said hers with the same steady precision she brought to everything she meant. And when the minister said, "husband and wife," and Thomas kissed her, Clara Patton made a sound that was not quite a sob but was undeniably adjacent to one. The wedding supper was at Mrs. Patton's, because of course it was, and it was the warmest evening Dorothy had spent since arriving in this territory. There was good food and excellent conversation, and Sam Ellery told 3 stories about Thomas's first years at Cross Creek that were both embarrassing and deeply flattering, and Thomas sat through them with the equanimity of a man secure enough in himself to find them funny. Dorothy laughed more that evening than she had in years. They moved into the house on the land in October. Brooks the builder had done a good job. It was a modest house, solidly made, with a porch that faced the creek and caught the evening light in exactly the way Thomas had described to her so long ago. It had 2 bedrooms and a proper kitchen, and a parlor with a window that Dorothy immediately designated as the reading window because of the quality of the light it received in the mornings. She hung a photograph of her father on the wall of the parlor, and she placed his copy of Dickens' works on the shelf she built beside the reading window, and she put the land deed, properly framed, on the wall beside it. Thomas looked at the framed deed on the wall one evening in November and said, "That should stay there forever." "It will," Dorothy said. The cattle operation began slowly, as first operations do, and Dorothy learned the work of it with the same thoroughness she brought to everything she undertook. She was not the kind of person who learned by watching. She learned by doing, by asking questions until she understood the reason behind every step, by making mistakes and correcting them and not making them again. Thomas was a patient teacher and a fair partner, and he treated her opinion on land and cattle matters as the opinion of an equal, which it increasingly was. The territory itself remained complicated. Dorothy had won her case, but the structural conditions that had made that case necessary had not changed, and she was aware of it. Aldous Cray was still the largest operator in the county, still had his friends in the right offices, still ran his operation in ways that benefited from those relationships. The injustice that had shaped the territory was not resolved by the fact that one woman had successfully contested one land claim, and Dorothy knew it. She joined a small civic group that was working to push for land office reform in the territory, and she wrote letters, very good, very precise, very hard to ignore letters to the territorial government and to the federal land office in Washington about the conditions that allowed the kind of manipulation that had been attempted in her case. She could not change everything. She knew that. But she could change what was in front of her, and she had always believed that this was where you started. In the spring of 1884, she discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Thomas on a morning in March, standing in the kitchen with the spring light coming through the window and the smell of coffee in the air, and he went absolutely still for a moment with the same quality of stillness he had when something large and real was landing in him. And then he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and held her with his hands in her hair, and his face pressed against the top of her head. And neither of them said anything for a long time, because there was nothing to say that was sufficient. The child was born in November of 1884, in the bedroom of the house on the land her father had left her, attended by the doctor from town and Clara Patton, who had appointed herself to the occasion with the authority of someone who is not going to be argued with. He was a boy, healthy and strong and furiously vocal from the very first moment, with dark hair like his father and, Thomas swore, Dorothy's expression of complete conviction. They named him Robert for her father, which made Gerald Finch, to whom Dorothy wrote the news, cry in his office, he later told her. Thomas held his son for the first time with the specific awe of a man confronted with something he had wanted without knowing how much until it was in his hands. And Dorothy, watching him from the bed with the exhausted clarity that follows great effort, thought that she had come across the Missouri River carrying more anger than any one person should reasonably carry, and had set it down here, in this red and golden and improbable territory. In exchange for something she had not known, she was also carrying underneath it the capacity for this, for a life this wide and this full, for a love this real. The years moved the way years do when they are good ones, not quickly exactly, but with a sense of momentum, of things building. Robert Lawson Redmond grew from a vocal, determined infant into a vocal, determined toddler, and then into a small boy who followed his father around the cattle operation with the focused attention of someone who is memorizing everything. He had his mother's mind for detail and his father's patience, which Thomas said was a remarkable combination and probably not fair to the other children. A second child came in the spring of 1887, a girl this time, whom they named Clara after Mrs. Patton, who received this information with the kind of composure she attempted and entirely failed to maintain. Clara Redmond arrived in the world with a tranquility that distinguished her immediately from her brother, and looked around the room on her first day in it with the expression, Dorothy said, of someone who has taken stock of the situation and found it acceptable. Thomas Redmond built a second room onto the house that summer and extended the porch, and planted an apple tree on the south side of the house that he said would take several years to bear fruit, but would be worth waiting for. Dorothy taught Robert to read at the kitchen table in the winter evenings, using her father's Dickens, and found in the teaching a satisfaction she had not felt since Cincinnati, the specific pleasure of a mind opening to the idea that the marks on a page could speak to you, could hold entire worlds in them. The cattle operation grew steadily, not dramatically, but in the reliable way of good management and appropriate caution. They hired a hand named Jessus Morales in the spring of 1886, a young man from a family who had been in the territory for generations, whose knowledge of the land and the cattle was deep and practical, and who became, over the following years, someone Dorothy and Thomas trusted as completely as they trusted anyone. He had a family of his own, in a small house 2 miles to the east, and his wife, Inez, became a genuine friend to Dorothy in the way that women become friends on the frontier, through the necessary sharing of resources and knowledge, and the kind of honesty that the West demanded. Sam Ellery died in the spring of 1887, peacefully, at the age of 72, in his bedroom at Cross Creek with Thomas beside him. He left the Cross Creek ranch to Thomas in his will, which Thomas had not expected, and which Dorothy suspected Sam had planned for longer than he had let on. Thomas stood in the lawyer's office in Calico Flats when the will was read and was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "He should have told me. It was not a complaint." It was the response of a man who would have liked the chance to argue, and who was also deeply, genuinely moved. They managed both operations. The Lawson parcel, which had grown to encompass an adjacent piece of land that came up for legal sale in 1886, and Cross Creek, which was the larger operation with the division of labor and the collaborative judgment of two people who had been working and thinking together for long enough that they had built, between them, a shared understanding of what they were doing and why. Calico Flats itself changed, across those years, in the way that Western towns changed in that era, slowly in some ways, dramatically in others. The railroad spur that came through in 1885 brought new commerce and new people, and with the new people came new pressures, both good and troubling. Dorothy continued her civic engagement with the same methodical persistence she had brought to the land case. She helped establish a proper school in town, having been the most qualified person in the county to make the argument for one, and served on the school board for 4 years. She continued writing letters about land reform, and while the territory systems changed slowly, they did change in some degree, and she believed, because she was a person who required actual results to sustain a conviction, that the pressure mattered even when its effects were not immediate. Aldous Cray sold most of his operation in 1888 and moved to Albuquerque, and Dorothy heard this news without particular satisfaction and without particular regret. She had not spent much energy on Cray after winning the case, having found that the building of things consumed rather more attention than the nursing of old grievances, and she was not inclined to reconsider that allocation. Miles Holt was elected sheriff in 1888, replacing the man who had been Cray's man for years, and Dorothy and Thomas attended his election celebration at the saloon, Dorothy's first visit to a saloon, which she found louder than necessary but surprisingly communal, and shook his hand, and told him the county would be better for it, which they meant. One evening in the autumn of 1889, 3 years after Sam Ellery's death, and 6 years after Dorothy had stepped off the stagecoach in Calico Flats with a carpetbag in one hand and a letter of grievance in the other, she sat on the porch of the house on her father's land and watched the evening light do what Thomas had described to her on a night so long ago it seemed like a different woman's life. The light turned the grass silver and the earth orange, and the creek below caught it in long, moving streaks. Robert, who was 5½ and deeply serious, was sitting beside her on the porch step, doing the thing he had recently developed, examining a small wooden carving his father had made him with the focused attention of a scholar. Clara was inside with Thomas, who was reading to her, his voice low and steady carrying through the open window. Dorothy listened to her husband reading to her daughter and watched the light, and thought about a woman who had crossed the Missouri River carrying enough anger to power a locomotive, who had arrived in a place she was prepared to hate, and had been proven, in the most fundamental ways, wrong about it. Not wrong about the injustice. She had not been wrong about that. The injustice had been real. The land had been taken through dishonest means. The systems had been designed to favor certain people. All of that was true, and she held it without softening it. But she had been wrong to think that the anger was the whole of what was available to her, that the fighting was the only mode the territory would permit. She had been wrong to think there was nothing here worth staying for, wrong to think that caring about a place and the people in it was an indulgence she could not afford. The screen door opened and Thomas came out, carrying Clara in one arm with the ease of long practice, and sat down in the chair beside her with Clara settled drowsily against his shoulder. He looked out at the evening light. He looked at Dorothy. He reached across and found her hand. "Robert has decided," he said, with the particular gravity one must bring to Robert's decisions, "that he would like a horse of his own." "He is 5, Dorothy said. "I told him that," Thomas said. "He pointed out that he has been around horses his whole life and feels ready for a greater level of responsibility." Dorothy looked at Robert, who was now watching them with the attentiveness of someone monitoring a negotiation. "He does have a point," she said. Thomas grinned at her, that wide, genuine, undone grin that was still the best thing she had ever seen on any face, and something bloomed in Dorothy's chest that was so large and so warm and so at home in her that she could not believe she had ever not had it. She thought about her father, who had read the land descriptions and felt this possibility in them before she could, who had seen something here worth reaching for even from the distance of Cincinnati and the end of his life. "Papa," Robert said, with the solemnity of 5-year-olds making important inquiries, "does Mama think I can have a horse?" Thomas looked at Dorothy with the expression of someone very interested in the answer. Dorothy looked at her son, who had her father's name and her own eyes and his father's steadiness, who was sitting on the porch of the house that stood on land she had crossed a continent to defend, in a territory she had arrived at with her fists closed and her heart locked, and had found, against all her intentions, to be the place where she became most fully herself. She looked at Thomas, who was watching her with all the warmth of 6 years in his gray eyes and Clara asleep on his shoulder, and every evening they had ever spent at the creek folded into the way he looked at her. "Next spring," Dorothy said to Robert, "when you are 6, we will find you a good, patient horse, and your father and I will both teach you to ride properly." Robert considered this verdict for a moment with great seriousness and then nodded, satisfied. "That is reasonable," he said, in a tone that was so precisely Dorothy's own that Thomas made a sound that was unmistakably suppressed laughter. Dorothy turned back to the evening, to the light on the land, to the sound of her husband beside her and her children around her, to the apple tree on the south side of the house that had fruited for the first time this year, just as Thomas had said it would, worth the waiting. The stars were beginning to appear at the eastern edge of the sky, first one, and then many, the enormous, crowded, unbelievable quantity of them that this territory produced every clear night. She had come west carrying a grudge against a whole territory. She had walked in every day with her armor on and her documents ready and her anger sharpened to a point, prepared to take what was rightfully hers and leave without looking back. She had taken what was rightfully hers. She had not left. She could not imagine leaving now any more than she could imagine uprooting the apple tree or dismantling the house or returning the land deed to a filing cabinet somewhere where no one could see it. This was her place. This improbable, difficult, extraordinary, beautiful place was hers, not only because the law said so, but because she had chosen it, and because it had given her things she had not known to ask for, in the form of a man with gray eyes who had told her once, on a warm, dark night between the creek and the edge of town, that she did not have to carry everything alone. She had not stopped being herself. She was still precise, still organized, still capable of excellent, well-reasoned indignation at injustice, still the woman who had walked into Gerald Finch's office with a sheaf of papers and a senator's letter, and no patience for being managed. She did not think love required you to stop being who you were. She thought the right kind of love required you to be more entirely yourself than you had ever managed to be alone, because you were being seen clearly enough that there was no longer any point in being anything other than what you actually were. Thomas squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. Clara sighed in her sleep. Robert, satisfied with the horse negotiation, returned to his carving. The light completed its extraordinary performance and gave way to dark, and the stars took over the whole immense sky, and Dorothy Lawson Redmond sat on the porch of her father's land and breathed in the warm night air of New Mexico territory and was, without qualification or reservation, home. The last entry in Dorothy's journal that year, written by lamplight at the kitchen table on the last day of October in 1889, with the household quiet around her and Thomas reading in the parlor beside the window she had designated for reading before she knew she was going to stay, read as follows. My father saw something in this land before I did. He was right about it. He usually was. I am sorry it took me so long to put down what I was carrying long enough to see it too, but I think he would have been glad to know I got here in the end. She closed the journal and corked her pen and went to the parlor where Thomas looked up from his book with the expression that was only ever for her, and she sat beside him, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into the particular warmth of him, and the lamp burned steadily, and the house was full of the breathing of children, and outside the window the New Mexico stars did what they always did, which was to be more numerous and more present than seemed possible, and entirely worth seeing.